What if I told you that the vegetables medieval farmers relied on to survive, the ones they planted, harvested, and ate every single day, are vegetables you'll likely never taste? From roots sweeter than carrots to greens sharper than spinach, entire foods once essential to survival have quietly vanished from our plates. Tonight, we'll explore these lost flavors of the Middle Ages, how they shaped daily life, and why they disappeared from history. Settle in, relax, and let these forgotten gardens guide you into sleep. Chapter 1. Forgotten Fields and Vanished Flavors. When you imagine medieval Europe, your mind might go to castles, knights, and great halls filled with feasts. But for most people, the daily question was much simpler. What could they grow, and what could they eat? Before the invention of modern agriculture, before the rise of global trade, and long before supermarkets stocked identical rows of familiar vegetables, the medieval kitchen relied on plants you may never have tasted or even heard of. You probably recognize carrots, peas, and cabbages as medieval staples, and you'd be right. But scattered across Europe's fields, monasteries, and peasant gardens grew a wider variety of vegetables, many of which have since disappeared from our tables. Some were pushed aside as farming practices changed. Others were replaced by more productive crops, and still others simply slipped out of fashion. To walk through a medieval garden was to walk among plants that connected to centuries of tradition but have now been lost to history. The first thing to understand is that medieval agriculture was deeply tied to local conditions. What grew in the rocky soils of Scandinavia was very different from what thrived in the warmer climates of Italy or Spain. And within that diversity were dozens of vegetables that modern people would scarcely recognize. Take skirret, for example. This now forgotten root vegetable was once a common food in Northern Europe. Resembling a pale carrot, it grew in clusters of thin, sweet roots that could be boiled, roasted, or mashed. Skirret was prized for its taste, but it fell out of use because it was fiddly to prepare. Its many roots contained woody cores that required careful trimming. When easier, more uniform vegetables like the potato arrived from the New World, skirret quickly vanished from European diets. Another medieval favorite was Alexander's, a leafy green that was once more common than celery. It grew wild along coastlines and in damp meadows, its hollow stalks and aromatic leaves used in soups and broths. In monasteries, Alexanders were considered an essential vegetable for their supposed medicinal properties. Yet as celery cultivation spread in the early modern period, Alexanders lost their place in gardens and became an almost forgotten plant. Even today, they survive mostly as a curiosity, growing wild in hedgerows rather than in anyone's kitchen. Imagine yourself as a medieval peasant in the 13th century, tending to a small garden outside your thatched hut. You might grow good King Henry, a perennial green sometimes called poor man's asparagus. Its leaves were boiled like spinach, its shoots eaten like asparagus, and its seeds ground into flour. This single plant could serve multiple purposes, which was vital when resources were scarce. But over time, it too faded from favor, replaced by vegetables that were easier to cultivate on a larger scale. Today, most people have never heard of it, let alone tasted it. Then there was purslane, a plant that grew almost everywhere, but was often considered a weed. Its succulent leaves were eaten in salads or stews, praised for their sharp, lemony taste. Purslane was even valued in Roman cooking and carried forward into medieval kitchens. Yet as agricultural systems became more controlled and the variety of acceptable vegetables narrowed, purslane was dismissed as a nuisance, something to be pulled up and thrown away. The same plant once eaten daily in medieval Europe now survives only in specialty gardens or in regions where it remains part of traditional diets. What makes these lost vegetables especially interesting is not only their disappearance, but also the role they played in shaping daily survival. Consider that peasants and serfs often had little control over the grain harvest, which largely went to their lords. What remained for them were the garden plots they maintained for themselves. In those gardens grew hardy vegetables that could withstand poor soil, irregular weather, and minimal care. Vegetables like skirret, Alexander's, and good King Henry were not luxuries. They were essential lifelines. The monasteries, too, played a role in preserving and spreading these vegetables. Monks were skilled gardeners, cultivating plants for food, medicine, and study. Herbals written in the Middle Ages describe these vegetables in detail, with sketches showing how to identify and prepare them. But even in these carefully maintained monastic gardens, change was constant. A vegetable could be praised in one century and forgotten in the next, its seeds lost or discarded as new crops took precedence. We might also think about taste. Modern palates are shaped by vegetables bred for sweetness, uniformity, and shelf life. Medieval vegetables often tasted stronger, more bitter, or more earthy. Alexander's, for instance, had a pungent flavor somewhere between celery and parsley, while good King Henry could taste sharp and slightly metallic compared to modern spinach. For peasants accustomed to simple diets, these flavors provided variety. But as wealthier households began to shape food fashions, tastes shifted toward milder, more refined vegetables, leaving the older plants behind. Some vegetables disappeared not because they were inferior, but because they did not fit into the emerging systems of trade and storage. Skirret, with its delicate roots, spoiled quickly and could not be stored for long journeys. Potatoes, by contrast, were hardy, abundant, and easier to keep. The arrival of New World crops fundamentally altered European diets, pushing many medieval vegetables into obscurity. So, as you sit and imagine these vanished gardens, you can picture not only the vegetables themselves, but also the lives that revolved around them. For the medieval farmer, tending pigs or plowing fields was only part of survival. The garden was where daily meals came to life. The plants grown there reflected centuries of adaptation to soil, climate, and culture. Yet many of those same plants are now forgotten, their seeds lost or their flavors unknown to us. And this raises a quiet but curious question. If so many vegetables could disappear from our diets, what does that tell us about the food we eat today and what might be lost in the centuries to come? Chapter 2. The Cultural and Medicinal Life of Forgotten Vegetables. If Section 1 gave us a sense of what medieval vegetables once existed and why they disappeared, Section 2 allows us to wander more slowly through their cultural meanings and medicinal uses. You see, in the Middle Ages, food was rarely just food. Every plant carried with it a symbolic meaning, a reputation for healing, and a place in the rhythm of daily life. Vegetables were not only eaten, but also prescribed, prayed over, or used to mark the seasons. Let's begin in the cloister gardens of medieval monasteries. Here, monks cultivated rows of vegetables not only for sustenance, but also for medicine, guided by the writings of classical authors like Galen and Dioscorides. To the medieval mind, vegetables existed within the framework of the humoral theory. Every plant was classified as hot or cold, moist or dry, and consuming it was thought to balance or imbalance the body's humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, take skirret. Beyond its sweet, fibrous roots, it was believed to strengthen the stomach and encourage digestion. Monastic herbals describe it boiled into broths for the sick or mashed into pastes for those who struggled with appetite. Its warming qualities made it a food for winter, when bodies were thought to become sluggish and cold. To eat skirret was not only to fill hunger, but also to restore a sense of balance. Alexander's, with their tall, aromatic stalks, were believed to cleanse the blood and ease flatulence. In early spring, when fresh greens were scarce after the long winter, Alexander's provided nourishment that monks described as both purgative and life-giving. Physicians of the time recommended its seeds and roots for digestive troubles, blending the boundaries between kitchen and apothecary. And then there was good King Henry, sometimes called all good or English mercury. Beyond its practical role as a spinach substitute, it was praised for healing wounds and soothing skin irritations. Peasants boiled its leaves not only for the table, but but also for poultices applied to aching joints or festering sores. The plant was so useful that it occupied a space in both the household garden and the village healer's toolkit. Now consider the symbolic weight of vegetables. In the medieval world, plants often stood as metaphors in sermons and stories. The fleeting, tender shoots of spring vegetables symbolized renewal and the promise of resurrection. Bitter greens, consumed during Lent, became physical reminders of spiritual discipline. Even the act of planting and tending a vegetable garden was infused with religious meaning, echoing the Garden of Eden and the duty of humans to cultivate the earth. It is in this context that vegetables like purslane gained their curious reputations. Purslane was considered cooling, which made it a remedy against fevers and inflammation. But its stubborn growth, sprouting even in the cracks of stone paths, gave it symbolic associations with resilience and humility. Medieval texts sometimes describe it as a poor man's cure, a plant that God had placed everywhere so that even the lowest peasant could find healing without paying for expensive herbs. Beyond the monastery and the peasant cottage, noble households also took note of vegetables, though their relationship was often more aesthetic than practical. In aristocratic gardens, vegetables mingled with flowers and herbs in geometric beds. Skirret and alexanders might appear alongside roses and lily, not only as food, but as signs of cultivated abundance. A lord or lady who could present a variety of fresh vegetables at table signaled wealth and connection to learned traditions. Of course, vegetables also played a role in survival strategies. In times of famine, when grain harvests failed or livestock herds dwindled, it was the humble garden plants that kept communities alive. Chroniclers record years of poor harvest when peasants turned to any edible green they could find: nettle soups, boiled dock leaves, or roasted roots dug from wild hedgerows. In these moments, vegetables were not curiosities. They were lifelines. Yet ironically, it was often the less glamorous vegetables that disappeared from records. Chroniclers described grain shortages in detail, but rarely lingered on what weeds or garden vegetables filled the gap. Thus, much of this quiet history of survival has been lost. The cultural weight of vegetables extended even into law and custom. In some villages, tenants were required to maintain kitchen gardens as part of their obligations to their lord. Certain plants were taxed or their seeds controlled to prevent shortages. Monasteries sometimes issued instructions for when and how vegetables were to be planted, aligning them with feast days or liturgical calendars. In these ways, vegetables became markers of time and duty, tying agricultural life to the rhythms of faith and governance. Another dimension is the social stratification of vegetables. For peasants, they were necessity. For nobles, sometimes a novelty. A dish of skirret at a noble feast might be dressed with spices and butter, while the same vegetable in a peasant's pot was boiled plain with a pinch of salt. The plant was the same, but its cultural meaning shifted according to who ate it and how it was served. Even the way vegetables were preserved shaped their role in society. Many medieval vegetables, unlike grain, were highly perishable. This meant they had to be consumed quickly or transformed, pickled in vinegar, salted, or dried. The act of preserving vegetables was not only a household task, but also a form of knowledge passed through generations. Some of these techniques disappeared along with the plants themselves, leaving us with only fragments of recipes in manuscripts or mentions in old household accounts. It is worth pausing to imagine the flavors of these vanished vegetables as they appeared in daily medieval life. Picture a peasant stew simmering in an iron pot over the hearth, skirret roots cut into chunks, good King Henry leaves floating like spinach, Alexander's stalks lending an aromatic sharpness. The stew would not have been luxurious, but it would have been nourishing, earthy, and deeply tied to place and season. Each bite carried not only sustenance, but centuries of tradition. By tracing the cultural and medicinal meanings of these vegetables, we can begin to see why their disappearance matters. They were not simply plants that vanished because potatoes or cabbages were more efficient. They carried symbolic and healing roles, shaping the rhythms of medieval life in ways that modern diets no longer reflect. When they disappeared, it was not only a loss of taste but a loss of meaning. And here lies an intriguing question. If so many vegetables once tied to medicine, symbolism, and survival could vanish without much trace, what might that suggest about the fragility of our own food culture today? Could some of the vegetables we see as common and indispensable now, tomatoes, carrots, or broccoli, one day fade into obscurity, remembered only in old books and forgotten gardens? Chapter 3. The arrival of new crops and the quiet end of old vegetables. By the late Middle Ages, the landscape of European food was already shifting. The centuries-old reliance on familiar vegetables like skirret, Alexander's Good King Henry, and purslane had created diets that felt stable and traditional. Yet this stability was fragile. Change would come not in sudden waves but in quiet ripples, carried across oceans and trade routes. Slowly, the vegetables that had been staples of daily life began to vanish, not with fanfare, but with the gradual inevitability of replacement. The most decisive shift came in the wake of the Columbian Exchange, the great movement of plants, animals, and people between the Old and New Worlds following Christopher Columbus's voyages in the late 15th century. What medieval people could not have imagined was that their most reliable garden companions would soon face competition from entirely new plants. These imports carried different flavors, longer shelf lives, and often greater yields, making them appealing to both peasants and elites. Consider the potato. Native to the Andes, it arrived in Europe by the late 16th century. At first, suspicion surrounded this unfamiliar tuber. Its association with the nightshade family made some wary, and early accounts suggest it was dismissed as food for animals. But once its potential was realized, the potato became a cornerstone of survival. Its caloric density, ability to grow in poor soils, and long storage capacity gave it advantages that skirret or parsnips could not match. By the 18th century, the potato was indispensable in many regions, especially in Northern Europe. Skirret, once treasured, receded quietly into obscurity, grown only in a few corners by traditional gardeners. Or take the tomato, another New World arrival. Initially grown as a curiosity in European gardens, sometimes even considered poisonous, it eventually transformed kitchens with its bright acidity and versatility. By the early modern period, tomatoes were central to Mediterranean cooking. Their rise shifted attention away from herbs and vegetables like Alexander's, whose sharp, celery-like flavor seemed redundant next to the vibrancy of the tomato. The common bean kidney, haricot, and other varieties from the Americas also displaced Europe's traditional broad beans and lentils in many households. Their nutritional value and culinary versatility gave them an edge. Over time, medieval pulses and greens lost ground, remembered only in rustic dishes or folk traditions. Even the humble maize, corn, though not universally adopted in Europe as it was in the Americas, contributed to changing crop rotations and diets. Each of these imports pushed medieval vegetables further into the margins. But the decline of medieval vegetables cannot be explained solely by foreign arrivals. Social and economic transformations also played a role. As Europe urbanized, food systems became increasingly commercialized. Farmers focused on crops that could withstand transport, store for long periods, and appeal to broader markets. Vegetables like Good King Henry, with its tendency to wilt quickly, simply did not adapt to the rhythms of a growing market economy. What had once been a household staple was now an inconvenience. There was also the matter of taste evolution. Palates shift with exposure to new flavors. The robust bitterness of medieval greens, once valued for their cleansing qualities, became less appealing when compared to the sweeter flavors of new vegetables. Over time, people preferred the mild crunch of cabbage, the sweetness of carrots, or the creaminess of potatoes. Bitter and fibrous plants, once common in every kitchen garden, became symbols of poverty or old-fashioned living. Religion and medicine also contributed to the decline. As the Renaissance advanced, humoral theory slowly lost its dominance to emerging scientific approaches. Vegetables were no longer seen primarily as balancing forces for the body's humors. Instead, their nutritional value was reconsidered through new lenses of anatomy and chemistry. In this shift, many plants lost the medicinal aura that had kept them culturally relevant. Skirret was no longer prized as a stomach-settling root when new remedies and more fashionable foods became available. And yet, not all traces of these vegetables disappeared. Even today, echoes of them survive in small ways. Heritage gardeners still cultivate skirret, praising its delicate sweetness and resistance to pests. Its seeds can be purchased from specialist nurseries, and chefs occasionally revive it in experimental dishes. Alexanders still grow wild along coasts and hedgerows in Britain and parts of Europe, their robust stalks a living reminder of forgotten feasts. Good King Henry is occasionally revived by foragers who value its spinach-like flavor, though most pass it by as an unremarkable weed. Purslane, once dismissed, has seen a modest revival thanks to its high omega-3 content, showing up in health-conscious kitchens and wild forage salads. It is striking to think that what was once everyday food for peasants has become the domain of niche gardeners, chefs, and herbalists. What was necessity has become novelty. In this sense, these vegetables are not entirely gone. They have simply slipped into the margins of our food culture, awaiting rediscovery. This raises a larger reflection about the fragility of food traditions. If entire categories of medieval vegetables could vanish within a few centuries, what might this say about our own modern staples? We think of potatoes, tomatoes, or beans as permanent fixtures, but history suggests otherwise. Climate change, shifting markets, or new agricultural innovations could one day render them obsolete. Perhaps centuries from now, historians will speak of broccoli or zucchini in the same way we speak of skirret or Alexanders today. Once common, now forgotten curiosities. The disappearance of medieval vegetables also highlights how much of human survival is tied to quiet, overlooked plants. Wars, kings, and battles dominate history books, but it was the reliable growth of good King Henry in cottage gardens that kept families alive through lean seasons. It was the dependable harvest of skirret that filled bowls when grain was scarce. These plants were unsung actors in the great drama of history, sustaining countless lives but rarely celebrated. As we conclude this exploration of vanished vegetables, it is worth remembering that the medieval diet was not static. It adapted constantly to weather, to trade, to cultural taste. The vegetables that vanished were not simply lost. They were replaced, reimagined, or folded into new traditions. And in their disappearance lies a lesson. Food culture is always changing, always fragile, and always more complex than it appears. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a medieval garden at dusk. The air carries the smell of earth and herbs. A peasant bends to pull good King Henry leaves for the evening meal. Skirret roots are dug from the soil, washed in a wooden bucket, and tossed into a stew. Pigs grunt in a sty nearby, waiting for scraps, while cows graze lazily in the meadow beyond. None of these people know that centuries later, their vegetables will vanish into obscurity, their flavors forgotten. To them, these plants are simply life itself, and perhaps that is the quietest, most important truth. History is not only shaped by kings and battles, but by the vegetables simmering in pots, keeping families fed and slowly, imperceptibly, disappearing from memory. And that brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey through history. If you found this story helped you relax, drift off, or simply learn something new, I'd love for you to join me again. Please take a moment to like this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep so you'll always have a calm companion for your nights. Thank you for spending your time here. Sleep well and good night.